And we will. Great. Okay. Well, friends, welcome to Where Does Jesus Stand? 5 Spiritual Practices to End Poverty. This is a part of an online, this is a part of a series of online workshops embracing the Matthew 25 call to the Presbyterian Church USA. If you would like to access Spanish interpretation, please click on the globe icon in your control panel and select Spanish. Also, a link to the Spanish language version of today's PowerPoint will also be pasted in chat for reference. And I can try that in Spanish, at least the first part of it. Les damos la bienvenida para acceder a la interpretación en español. Dele clic en el globo interpretación y luego selección español. All right. Anyway, my name is Reverend Carl Horton, and I welcome you. I am the coordinator of the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program. I have also been serving alongside Mission Agency and Mid-Council colleagues as members of the Eradicating Systemic Poverty Working Group. As we get started, the first thing we'd like to give you a chance to do is to introduce yourselves. So please make use of chat. And if you would go ahead and in the chat, go ahead and post your name and location, and we'll just take a minute for you to do that and notice those and see who's with us today. And I will not say hello to everyone, but hello to everyone. There are 115 of us so far and growing. So if you'll just add your name and where you are located in the chat. And while you do that, we have a couple of polls I thought we would start with to sort of get a sense of who we have in the chat room today, in the Zoom room today. So the first poll that we want to ask you to select one response is about Matthew 25 involvement. And just trying to get a sense of how many of us are connected to the Matthew 25 initiative. So Debbie, if you would post that first poll, if you will select one of these. I am a part of a Matthew 25 congregation or worshiping community.
Both questions are in this poll, so they can answer both questions.
Oh, all right. Well, let me read both questions to you, and then you can respond to the poll. So the first one's about your Matthew 25 involvement, and the second poll
Sorry to interrupt you, Carl, but Debbie, it sounds like we still need to have the interpretation turned on.
Oh.
Victor messaged me, and we just want to be sure that people are hearing this recording and webinar in Spanish if they so choose.
Okay, I'm gonna pause for a second.
Déjame hacer una pausa por un segundo.
So let's just make sure we
Así
get
que
the
asegurémonos
Spanish
que
working.
tengamos la parte de español trabajando.
Está trabajando.
We're hearing the interpreters.
Okay, estamos escuchando a las intérpretes.
Sí.
Yes.
So Victor,
In the main
is this
meeting.
fixed?
En la reunión
Yes.
principal.
But we're not hearing it in the, if our interpreter.
Pero no estamos escuchando a nuestra intérprete.
Hello, everybody. It's Janet. I think they turned off the interpretation. The reason why Victor could not hear us is because he was assigned as an interpreter. He needs to not be assigned as an interpreter because I think he could
Start the recording.
And we're going to do the polls.
So you've had a behind the scenes. Let me do the introduction one more time just to make sure the recording includes that. So friends, welcome to Where Does Jesus Stand? 5 Spiritual Practices to End Poverty. This is a part of our series of online workshops embracing the Matthew 25 call to the Presbyterian Church USA. We have got the interpretation worked out. And we are posting the PowerPoint in Spanish language for those who would like to see that. My name's Carl Horton. I am the coordinator of the Peacemaking Program, and I serve alongside Mission Agency and Mid-Council colleagues on what we are calling the Eradicating Systemic Poverty Working Group. So far, those who have joined have added their names and locations to the chat, and we'd invite you, if you're just joining now, to please put your name and location in our chat. And then we're going to launch a couple of polls just to see, get a sense of who's in the room and your experience level with Matthew 25 and with poverty work. So the first poll that you'll see, well, actually they're together, but two questions. One is your Matthew 25 involvement. Are you a part of a Matthew 25 congregation and worshiping community? Are you a part of a Matthew 25 curious congregation and worshiping community, maybe looking into it, but not quite there yet? Are you a part of a congregation or worshiping community that has declined to be a part of a Matthew 25 at this time? Or would you answer Matthew 25? Question mark. So respond to that poll. And then the second question is about your experience in poverty work. Whether you have extensive experience in poverty work, have moderate level of experience in poverty work, or if you're relatively new to poverty work. So let's see if we can get those polls launched and what that looks like. And we'll give you a minute to respond. Okay, and we'll give you another minute just to make sure you can answer both of these questions, and then we'll take a look at this. We've got,
I'll let you know when we get to 90-something%.
yeah, great. So just looking at what I can see, it looks like we have a good number of you that are Matthew 25 congregations. Go ahead and close that, Debbie. We're good with, we got to 80. Some folks may not be in a position where they're able to do that. I can end that. Okay, and let's show the results. Whoops, uh-oh.
Can you see them?
Not yet. Oh, you can. Great. Okay. So it looks like almost 70% of those with us today are a part of Matthew 25. And 16% are curious about Matthew 25. 8% of our congregations present have chosen not to take part right now. And there's 6% wonder, what is Matthew 25? So great. I'm glad you're here today. Your experience in poverty work, the vast majority of the folks present have moderate experience or are relatively new. There's about 14% of you that said you have extensive experience. So we've got a nice range of experience with poverty work, and I hope today's seminar workshop will provide something for everybody. So we're glad you're here today, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Laura Van Dale, who's going to talk to us about some assertions.
Thanks, Carl. And I am going to invite both Una and Jeff to raise their little Zoom hands and unmute themselves so they can be ready to be readers. We begin our gathering today with a few assertions, things that we proclaim to believe as followers of Jesus engaging in anti-poverty work. These assertions are grounded in scripture and in our Presbyterian confessions and have been created by our anti-poverty working group. Today we are sharing 3 of them as a way to center us as we move into our session together. So I would invite you to silently read along with us as we say what we believe. We repent that Christians have misunderstood or been misled by biblical passages taken out of context or by theological interpretations that distort the gospel's original intention. We repent that the church has used scripture to uphold systems that perpetuate oppression and poverty. We do not believe that, quote, the poor will always be with us, indicates poverty is inevitable or God's will. We do not believe that blessed are the poor in spirit indicates it is a blessing to lack economic sufficiency or basic human rights. We do not believe in a prosperity gospel where God blesses faithful people with economic riches or condemns unfaithful people to poverty.
We believe Jesus Christ models how we are to live in community and to confront systems of injustice, including poverty. Jesus Christ taught us to care for the vulnerable, to be a good neighbor, provide food to the hungry. Christ proclaims good news to the poor. Jesus Christ came not to condemn the world, but to save it.
We declare that poverty is not a personal problem, but a corporate sin, and that a church that is indifferent to poverty or evades responsibility in economic affairs or is open to one social class only offers no acceptable worship to God. Enslaving poverty in a world of abundance is an intolerable violation of God's good creation.
I'm Alonzo Johnson, and I am the director of the Presbyterian Committee on the Self-Development of People, and it's good to be with you here today. It's important when we hear about systemic poverty to really flesh that out and talk about what is systemic poverty. We hear it, but many of us may not be aware of what that really means. Systemic poverty, it refers to the economic exploitation of people who are poor through laws, policies, practices, and systems that perpetuate their impoverished status. Poverty is really complex, and it overlaps with many other social ills and oppressive structures in our society. In the words of James Baldwin, it is expensive to be poor. And systemic poverty is an aspect of institutional, cultural, historical factors that coalesce. There are confluence of these factors that contribute to poverty. Economic exploitation is one. So here's the question for you to ponder as we are doing this portion is, why are people poor in your area? And as we are going through this idea of what it means to understand systemic poverty, I want to challenge you to be thinking about this. Why are people poor in your area? How has poverty touched your life, your community, or your church? So just keep thinking about this as we move through this aspect of systemic poverty. And as you think about this, you may think that, hey, people are poor in our area because X, Y, and Z. And it's important to understand why that is the case. I'm going to ask Rebecca to go to the next slide. So why are people poor? Hopefully, as you are thinking about this, you are also thinking about these aspects of systemic poverty. We have to deal with the root causes of poverty. And a lot of this is lack of access to a variety of different things. I think the key word here is systems. So when we think about things like the exploitation of people who are poor through laws, policies, practices, systems, we think about the lack of access to quality, sustainable employment. So we think about underemployment. We think about the wage gap, or think about employment situations like union busting. These particular types of things that play large roles in the aspect of employment and issues that affect individuals. Or take affordable housing. Here's another really important aspect of why people are struggling. Do you realize that there is a saying, the rent eats first? And that saying basically is derived from the fact that much of our rents are far too high, taking more than 20–30% of one's paycheck, of one's salary. So affordable housing is an issue that we need to have conversations about, because this is also part of this idea of policies and practices. Many years ago, the historical aspect of this was redlining. Many of you may be familiar with this term, and many of you may not be, but redlining was the systemic practice of keeping Black and brown people out of certain neighborhoods. Or how about healthcare? As we look at systems, who has access to healthcare? See, people, sometimes we think about things and we say, well, the poor, they can afford cell phones and TVs and nice clothes. And the reality is that TVs, you can't eat TVs and cell phones, and you certainly can't take a TV or a cell phone or nice clothes and trade it in for healthcare. So healthcare is another issue. Or what about reputable financial products, like loans and credit? Who can get credit? As you all are aware, we live in a world where credit runs everything. If you have bad credit, you're not able to get a home. If you have bad credit, you may not be able to get transportation. So these are the things that we need to think about. And of course, education on many different levels. As a system of education, where we have schools that are underfunctioning. I remember years ago working in a prison, to have one of the inmates say to me, I am here because I could not read the confession that I signed. So education is a large part of this. And when we talk about education too, here are some of the things that we, when we talk about systemic poverty in education, here's some of the things that we have to recognize. If folks cannot read documents, to sign certain documents, to get particular types of help, they won't be able to have access to that help. And these are the kinds of things that we need to think about when we're talking about systemic poverty. Intersectionality is a really important part of this. This term comes from the incredible lawyer, Kimberly Crenshaw, who shows us that there are more than one thing at work. There are always, again, a confluence of issues at work. So this drawing is designed to help you understand a little better about what is meant by systemic poverty. Since the Presbyterian Church, since we have stood up and made our voices heard about cash bail, let's use that for a quick example. So cash bail runs into all these intersections, right? To be poor in America, let's say poor Black male, young. And so there's a connection of both jail, race, education, gender. These things come together. So if someone cannot pay the bail, the cash bail that's set for them, they may lose their job. They are no longer able to go to school. So these are the kinds of things that when we think about with intersectionality, we think about how all these systems come together. It recognizes systemic poverty, the causal forces. Now we use mass incarceration as one example, but we can also use policies and laws as another example. Very quickly, do you understand and know that since 1996, our understanding of welfare has changed considerably? And in that change, now states get block grants to offer to families as a way to address the issues of welfare under things like TANF, and I will explain what TANF is. And TANF, which is also called the Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, we call that kind of welfare to work at one particular point in time. As states get block grants, this does not mean that folks who are poor are receiving the money from block grants. Now, let's take Kentucky, for example, really quickly. Kentucky has been very good with their particular block grants, as they have created something called Kentucky Connect, which helps families with CHIP, so there's helping families, poor families, have access to various modes of healthcare. But there are states that are sitting on a lot of money. Some states have put this money into things like Christian camps. Some have put it into things like marriage counseling. And so these grants are different. And so it's a mixture of a variety of things. It's bureaucracy. In some cases, it's race. And there are reasons why people are not able to get the kinds of things they need. I'm going to ask Rebecca to go to the next slide. So what do we say about poverty? Now think about the intersections. What does it mean to be a BIPOC woman who is not paid enough? Or what does it mean to be an immigrant in this country, especially one who is undocumented, who have no access to federal aid? So think about what PCUSA, what we say about poverty. This comes from one of our policies. Yes, we have said this as a church. And this comes from Hope for a Global Future towards a just and sustainable human development. And it talks about acute poverty having many different causes. And in this part, a consequence of each country's history, such as colonial expectation, sometimes compounded by domestic ethnic rivalry, and the failure of unifying national leadership, even when there's adequate resources are potentially available to satisfy basic needs. So think about this. Think about factors as corruption, where people are not getting the kind of money they need. And in these block grants that I mentioned for some of our states, the federal government has no say, and they cannot even change or in any way modify how these block grants are given out. Or let's talk about, economic mismanagement, which happens often. And so with earnings and wage gap, right? So the average CEO makes how much more than the average employee, right? And so these are the kinds of things we have to think about. Fuel costs have gone up 150%. So these are other things that in Tennessee, $700 million of welfare fund had been banked, not given to people. So when we think about economic mismanagement and elite minorities, excessive military expenditures, $8 billion for a military budget. If you take $8 billion and you break that down, you can start to think about how we can fund health programs, how schools can be funded, these particular types of things. So when you look at these particular aspects of poverty, and this one especially can be, it's one for not just the United States, but for around the world, we see that many of these factors are an integral part of creating systemic poverty. And this is important for us to understand, because we have to move away from blaming people, from saying that people are responsible or they're lazy. There are irresponsible and lazy people in every part of the human strata. This goes beyond the poor. So when we talk about poverty, this goes beyond the poor. This are larger questions about cultures of exploitation and segregation, discrimination. I don't know if you recognize that 1 in 5 elderly folks usually will neglect almost $140 billion of food stamps left on the table, because they may not be aware of what's going on or what's offered to them, the bureaucracy and the paperwork. And so when you think about systemic poverty, we think about these confluence of issues. If you've ever spent time, and I don't know how many of you have, and I'm not going to assume you haven't, because some of you may have. And as a child, I know my mom did, but if you ever spend time trying to get welfare, you understand that this is not an easy undertaking, that this is lengthy, and that in many cases, the paperwork alone, the bureaucracy alone, causes people to drop out of the system. And so these are the kinds of things that we need to think about as churches, as communities. What are people facing? Child poverty rate is high. Or think about things, when you look at this list, think about things like payday loans and how folks are caught up in payday loans trying to catch up with money that they owe. And the kinds of things with payday loans and fees that decimate communities. And so these are the things that we need to talk about when we talk about systemic poverty. Folks not having access to healthcare, right? Fuel costs going up, cost of living going up, jobs not being as plentiful. There are plenty of jobs, But think about this. As you are thinking about the poor around you in the cities you're in, ask yourself questions like this. Does your city have enough transportation for people to get to and fro a job? Do you have a rail in your city? Do you have efficient bus lines in your city so that people can have access? Because in many cities, this is not the case. Some folks are not able to make it to work and to get on 3 buses or to pay $20 a day for Uber or Lyft to get to work. So these are some of the things that we need to think about. This is why I agree with Baldwin when he says poverty is expensive. And so as we think about these things and move on to this next portion that will be led by Rebecca Barnes, I want you to continue to think about several things. The question that was asked, who are the poor around you? And I also want you to continue to think about the fact that poverty is not about bad choices, bad morality, personal responsibility. My mother, we were poor for many years. And the last thing I would ever say about my mom was that she made poor choices or was not very responsible. But I did know that my mother was taking care of a sick husband, which accelerated our poverty. So I want you to think about all these factors as we move on to the next portion.
Great, thanks, Alonzo, for sharing how deep and broad are the things we think about when we think about the systemic nature of poverty. And when you signed up to attend this webinar, part of the title is not only where does Jesus stand, and thus where should we stand, but what are 5 spiritual practices to end poverty? And as our planning team, our consulting group, mid-councils and denominational leaders were thinking together, we thought that really as people of faith, we need to spiritually practice the concerns of systemic poverty in all aspects of our personal lives and in our congregational lives and in our communities. And so what that looks like for us is taking those concerns into our worship, prayer, and spiritual life. It means taking those concerns into our Christian education and our spaces of learning with youth and children, and delving more deeply into unpacking those things that Alonzo named as root causes of poverty. We believe we need to be in real relationships with humility, with graciousness, to form bridges and build relationships with people who are not like us, so that together we can stand in friendship and in solidarity as we tackle causes of poverty and create communities that are healthy and thriving. We know we are called by God to action, and we act through things like community organizing or public policy advocacy or other hands-on ways. And finally, we know we're called to share, that what we have comes from God and is not our own. So that might be financial sharing of gifts and resources, but it also might be sharing the land, the property that your church owns, the skills and gifts and wisdom of your church members to be active in the community. So as we look at these practices, there are things we will never get perfect. So that's why we practice them. We do this lifelong learning as we delve into these practices. And we know they're all deeply spiritual. It's not only when we worship God that we're living out our faith, but it's also when we're taking action. It's also when we're being friends with people who are different than we are. So all of those things are deeply spiritual. Our work is guided by these 3 core principles, and we'll list a website later that has almost all of these things that you are seeing, and we will send a follow-up email so you may have these as well. But the core principles our team came up with are to be present with, listen to, and be led by those who live in impacted communities, to seek equity and diversity in leadership, and to learn about systems, structures, and practices that perpetuate poverty. So we are doing this webinar. There will be more to come throughout this year as we seek to engage these 5 spiritual practices. And I should have said at the beginning, I'm Rebecca Barnes, and along with my wonderful colleagues you've already met, I coordinate the Presbyterian Hunger Program, and I'm so grateful to be with you all. So we have some stories to share with you. They're video stories for the first 2, and then a community story that our colleague Ellen will share. And so with the grace of God, we prayed that these stories will go well as I get them loaded here. The first one comes from our partner, the Poor People's Campaign. So we listen to the voices, the wisdom that they've collected here. Let me make sure I did the audio. I'm going to stop sharing and make sure when I go to share, I have done the correct boxes. Okay, let's try that.
I worked 41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
At one time, poverty was a temporary condition. You were on a down slope for a minute, but you could bounce back up. We can't bounce back up today. It's permanent. We're not going back to the factory and building cars and trucks like we once did.
A job working at McDonald's or the grocery store doesn't pay enough for one person to live.
We work a 40-hour work week, still not enough. Living from paycheck to paycheck. Rent is $600 a month. We got water bill, electricity. I do this for my kids, and it hurts.
I'm 46 years old. I've lived in poverty here in West Virginia every day of my life. And I'm working. I am working poor with a bachelor's degree. I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
We were in the height of mass water shutoffs. This entire neighborhood was shut off all at one time.
I saw all my neighbors get shut off right in front of me. It was kind of terrifying.
I'm 42 years old and I'm a cashier at McDonald's. I had lost my house. You're welcome to come inside. There's a lot of people that are living in their cars. You never notice until you're in the same situation.
I have stuff to give my children. I'm paying all these bills and they need school clothes and stuff. And they be asking me for it, I can't get it to them.
Now I'm a Kansas farmer's wife. Kansas farmers are committing suicide. Why? They're usually in debt up to their eyeballs.
I see poverty in my own community. You know, there's a 70% unemployment rate in the reservation right now.
Here in New York City, we're home to millionaires and billionaires, and we have so many people living in the street, and that's just not right.
I've been a homeless veteran twice, lived in a shelter.
I've been living down here since I was 17.
My only chance of going to college was joining the Army. We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
700,000 people in this country are on the verge of losing their food stamps.
This budget calls for shrinking the social safety net programs like Medicare.
I just know that everything that's happening to us isn't right.
I'm in stage 5 of kidney disease. I fell behind on my health care and they canceled my health insurance and they told me I have to wait until open enrollment. There's only 5 stages of kidney disease and I'm in the 5th stage. Murder, it's murder. You know, if you ask me, it's murder.
I lost a son to gun violence. And I lost a daughter.
No parent should have, in America, should have to bury their child for lack of medical expense. I'm wailing because my children
my God.
are no more.
My God, Kelly.
Well, I'm wailing, y'all. Wailing. babies ain't no more? How many more babies? How many more children? No more.
I want you to know that when hands that once picked cotton join hands of Latinos, join hands of progressive whites, join faith hands and labor hands and Asian hands and Native American hands and poor hands and wealthy hands with a conscience and gay hands and straight hands and trans hands and Christian hands and Jewish hands and Muslim hands and Hindu hands and Buddhist hands, when we all get together, we are an instrument of redemption. When we join hands, we can revive and make sure that the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and equal protection under the law is never taken away from anybody. So I got a question. Are the rejected ready to revive and declare that this land is your land, this land is my land, this land is our land, and together from the State House to the White House, the rejected are going to demand that this nation never give up on being one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Our next story, which is also a compilation of voices and powerful witnesses, comes to us from PCUSA mission coworker Christy Boyd, who is a part of this poverty working group. And we're so thankful to her as she is currently in Congo and yet has worked all over in different parts of the continent of Africa, walking with siblings. And these stories from our international siblings come to us to again unpack the intersectionality of what it means to think about root causes of poverty and all that is involved. So let us continue to listen to the voices that come to us.
Ngai kombo na ngai papa Pierre Bonkono nazali na kati na église ya CPK nazali vice président ya diacre nazalaki na vision ya kokanisa lolenge bandeko na ngai bazali komona pasi na ndenge ya komitumisama na makambo ya leta na ndenge ya komitumisama mpo na kambo ndenge ya kobikela na ndenge ya komitumisama ndenge ya kovanda na ndenge ya kobongisa avenir na bango. Tozali na otali domaine ya droit de l'homme. Ozali ko défendre bandeko na biso soki ya likambo tokoyeba kolandela yango soki basalaki mbeba na kati ube na mosala ube basonaki na moninga ube bantu ube la police soki bakangaki ye ekoyeba ko défendre mokomukuka makoki ya ko défendre yango.
Et j'ai vu 4 policiers qui viennent du type, accompagnés avec les autorités des groupements. On m'a arrêté avec pasteur Bilali et pasteur Bakamba Mbamba, pasteur d'ici. Qu'est-ce qu'on nous avait dit à Itipo? Nous avions cherché des bêtes, du poisson et de l'argent. Après avoir reversé, on nous a libérés. Et avant de verser cet argent, on vous a frappé beaucoup, on vous a fouetté. Et vous commencez à pleurer, là on va vous libérer. Et j'ai parlé dans la radio que on nous a arrêtés à cause de l'église. Pourquoi? Où se trouvez-vous, droit de l'homme? Vous ne pouvez pas nous défendre, nous les peuples autochtones.
Biloko wana, moi je peux dire dans environnement. Pour la etali bandeko bazamba la bango ezali na bango sikonde bato ba exploitation forestière nde bazali kotumisa bango mingi nde toye komeka pe kobundaka mpona kosalela mpona bango ke batika bandeko bazala bazamba la bango kimia nde toyei kobundaka na makoki yango me nde toyei komona mpasi ke leta nde azali kotia biso mpo na kotinda baexploitation forestière sa kosala misala bango sa accord na biso tokaka bacommunauté malamu te na baexploitation forestière.
sikoyo leta akomi kokata banzete na biso wana kokata banzete sika tokomi sika bamoso bamoni yo akimi bon sika bakuna ndenge nini nzamba ekomi leta aganise biso na nzamba na biso biso kwa nzamba yandro ba le premier président de l'État du Congo nani bazeli biso ba nzamba biso bazango bango bakinambo nzamba ko sazika bono
yo yebisi biso ke bofandi bien problème
tovandi bien na parti oyo mbuzu tovandi bien bamutu baza na se kuna na nzamba baza na nzamba mpe o babima
yo olobini
nalobi mpo na botala biso likamwana mpo na likamitali nzamba.
Gouvernement ayebi très bien biso tobikelaka na zamba likambo ya liboso nde yango wana tobikelaka na zamba na bamai oyo esengeli biso tobikela na yango biso bapeuple autochtone bazali na bikoro na ingenge biso bazamba na biso ezali lisusu te ndenge tozalaki kalakala te oyo biloko esengeli ke tokei na zamba na biso na basi mpe tokei toramase biloko bakeye te baramasage banyama mbisi nyonso ezali lisusu te nde yango wana teke epesi biso mpasi mingi ya koyeba kosalela eloko wana lisusu te tokoyeba kozwa makoki ya koyeba kosunga mabota te
epa na biso esika tovandi awa biso tozali kolia malamu te lokola bino nzambe alingi biso asungi biso bino boyei kolokota biso tomona polele biso tosukwama tolongwa na bombo tozalaki na ezibito tobimi na ngonga oyo biso tolingi polele moninga kosa moninga te nasomba lipapa nasomba liputa nakei kokatela ndo kuna nateranga naye kokata matiti moi na sisi kokata apesi ngai sengiso wana nakosala pisoki nakomisi mois te nakosomba piesi te nakosomba eloko akolia nalunga te mwa ndunda mwa koto mwa ngai nameki mwa mimboya nameki kolamba ipe na banzambo tokokata mpe bilanga te epa na bango mpe tokata elanga opesi ye mbongo apesi yo mwa ndambo okati lisusu mpo na kotimola kwanga okomi kopesa lisusu epa na biso toikonyokona
soki akosepela atika biso zamba na biso ezala intact toyeba kosalela bazamba na biso na ulenge oyo tosalelaka ndenge ya kobatela zamba na biso malamu nakaisi na makambo etali troubière na zingadinga na mipanzi wana puisque oyo ezali kita oyo ebonisi ke nzambe abongiseli mpo na biso
awa ezali ebandeli ya troubière ebandi nde awa oyo nyonso tu etandi oyo nyonso to kuna mosika kaka ti fleuve kaka ye na ye kaka troubière entoku oyo potopoto oyo oyo potopoto eza kobomba baoxygène nyonso to bagaz oyo eza ekutana mabe eza korebomba yango depuis immémoriaux des années siècles de siècles oyo puisque eza kosala mosala monene mpo akobomba mopempo ya mabe bagaz yango ezali toujours na bajamba na biso totika ke toboyi mobu mpa soki okati banzete oyo ekozala polele mopepe oyo gaz oyo ekosala explosion moko monene baf ebomiere mosusu tokomi na décadence toboyi te l'État azali na mokili na ye mais biso bagardien lokola bapekisi biso tosala bandobo te tosala chasse te tozwa bachome te mpo tobandele na biso ya bandako te mais l'État akanisela biso
soki lolenge bamoni yango lolenge bayoki yango esengeli yende bango nde balobela biso kuna na Kinshasa balobela biso na mokili mobimba soki ayebi na kobatela biso mpe tokoyeba kobatela ye nzambe akosunga makoki nyonso.
And we'll turn it over to Ellen to share some thoughts and reflections she has about another story.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you today. My name is Ellen Sherby, and I'm based here in Louisville, Kentucky. I am an associate director with World Mission, and I'm also very involved with the immigrant community in Kentucky. I'm married to an immigrant from Honduras, so we have an immigrant family living in different places. And we work with immigrant community here in Louisville as well. So the story I would like to bring to you today is a personal story, a family story that I think links the stories we've already heard and the voices we've heard from what poverty looks like and feels like, and some of the causes of poverty in the United States and in other places around the world. The roots, and as Alonso shared earlier, are deep and they're complex. And yet I think we have a responsibility to keep learning about those roots and learning how they are connected. So it's important to hear these stories, to hear these voices, and to keep asking questions. As Alonso asked earlier, why are people poor? And to really look deeply at that. And I would add to that, looking at as those roots, but also the branches that come out of that, out of those roots and out of the poverty, the cost of people, the cost that poverty brings, not just financially, but other kinds of costs to people and communities and countries because of poverty. So this is the family story. My husband Elmer is from a farming family in Honduras. And like I mentioned, we have many family in the US and in Spain. One sister of his had to go to Guatemala. So they've been in different places and they didn't want to leave Honduras. I think Elmer's the exception. He married me and we came here because we got married and had an opportunity to live and work here. But none of the family, siblings, nephews, nieces have left Honduras because they wanted an adventure or because they just on a whim, they thought they'd leave. They each have unique stories. And so the little story I'm going to tell you is about a family member and just starting in the countryside of their family situation where, so like we heard in the story we just heard, resources are also often taken advantage of by corporations, or in the case of many family of ours in Honduras who worked in farming, every year the middleman would come around and tell you, I'll tell you what, if you plant beans, I'm going to buy those beans at, let's say $25 for that 100-pound weight of beans. Guess what would happen a few months later with the harvest? And I'm sure this is a familiar story to many of you or any of you who grew up in any kind of farming community. The price would be cut in half, but there'd be no choice but to just accept that price because they would have worked for months without any income. And you're working hard and you just have to sell the product, your harvest, for whatever you're offered, even though it wasn't what you were told at the beginning. And so there's lots of circumstances like this in my husband's family. This is the story I'm sharing with you. That was the reality. And one of the family members in that same reality that my husband grew up with didn't want to farm. None of them wanted to farm. They couldn't afford to farm. So this particular person worked in trucking, worked for a couple of different companies. It was hard work. It would be less than maybe $20, $25 a day, working maybe 10, 12, 14 hours, dangerous work. He was held up at least 3 or 4 times at gunpoint. And one time the truck he was driving was stolen. And he was blamed for that theft and had to go find it, had to go find the truck that was stolen. So at the end of the day, it wasn't safe for him. He wasn't making enough money, and he chose to come to the United States. He left his family there, and he left them very unwillingly, but he didn't see another option. And the way I describe this to people here in the US when I talk about his story is he had to choose between being a parent and a spouse to his family, present with them in presence, physical presence. So a parent and a spouse who could provide, or a parent or a spouse who could be present. So he chose to provide He chose to support his family and he came to the US. There is not an easy way to come to the US if you don't have a lot of resources, money, land. Just a quick side note, none of my husband's family can come visit us as tourists. Why? Because they're poor. Now, my in-laws can because they're over the age of 80. They're not a flight risk. None of my many brothers and sisters-in-laws, nieces and nephews can visit us. They cannot get a US visa to be a tourist in the United States. So you can imagine it's much more difficult to have a residency here. And that's a whole nother conversation to get into immigration issues. But this family member came here to make ends meet, to help his family back in Honduras be able to survive and to maybe thrive a little bit. And in the United States, if you don't have documents, if you don't have a social security number, Alonso touched on this as well, you don't have access. You don't have access. And now we've learned recently, not even like, so renting an apartment or a house, you'd have to do it through somebody else. That person might charge you money for using, for having their name on the contract. And some people really abuse that. They stand in as a straw person or a kind of a surrogate person to get help you get a car, help you get a house. A lot of exploitation. So if you don't have documents, it's easier for an employer to take advantage of you. We've described it in Spanish and in English as kind of having the boot on your neck. You can't really complain because you could lose your job. And there's many stories around that I could share. So all of this is just to say, to wrap up, I think we need to, maybe we should try to address systems. We need to listen and learn from stories like these and other stories and realize there are intricacies and unique situations in each individual, each family, each community, each city, each state, and each country to really get into. We shouldn't simplify things, but we can also look at people with compassion and realize it's not about having pity for people, feeling sorry for them, but understanding that there are complexities. You see an immigrant perhaps in your community and know there's or other people from other realities and have a recognition that their story is not simple, and they're not here because they came on a lark. They came here to survive. So let's address systems and let's treat each other with compassion because we don't know the stories that each one holds. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. As I share the next slide about some action steps and future ways to connect, I want to draw your attention. Carl put in the chat box that if you have questions, we will have a few minutes before we then send folks who want further chance to connect with each other, tell each other what you're involved in, what questions you have in a small group setting. But we will try to entertain a couple questions if we see them in the chat box in the next few minutes. And yes, just want to affirm the appreciation for sharing personal stories, for lifting up voices of all those that are struggling and fighting to make a better world. So I will share that the team of folks who has been working together has created a curated suggestion for resources under those 5 areas that I mentioned early, or resources for worship, learning, relationship building, action, and sharing of resources. If you go to pcusa.org/MT25poverty, you'll see various pages for resources as well as action suggestions. So our mid-council and national staff team came up with a list of ways you could take action and get involved. You also will see a resource packet you could download and use, and that has core principles, assessment questions, so that you can go further into those. And we wanted to note then that this was our first webinar this year where we're learning and listening to some of the systemic nature of poverty and stories being shared. But we will go more into actions, effective models to engage in eradicating poverty, to build community both domestically and internationally, as well as how to measure our impact as we engage different initiatives. So there are a couple more webinars coming up, and we'll send these to you by email afterwards for those of you who pre-registered. There will be 2 more on the other main foci of Matthew 25, congregational vitality in mid-August, dismantling structural racism in early November. But we'll also come back and be touching a couple times on systemic poverty. We'll have a gathering June 29th, August 28th, and October 30th with a different focus for each one. So we'll send you more details about that, and we'll put in the chat a registration link for the one that's in about a month. That is on measuring our impact holistically, to think about how we're engaging in ministry. And finally, we wanted to also recommend, you think in your churches or in your own lives, if you'd like an in-person opportunity to connect with us, with each other, we are hoping to see you in Atlanta, January of 2024. The slide should stay. This is next January for Matthew 25 Summit. So I just wanted to share that to let folks know that there were future opportunities, even though we will only be on together for another little bit here. We do hope to continue to build relationship with you, get to know you, hear what you're doing, and have these other opportunities to engage. I don't know, Carl, if you have received any questions or if people want to raise their hand and ask one. We have a few minutes before Ellen explains and sends us into small groups if folks want.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I don't see any chat questions, so let's open it up for a hand raise. If anybody has a wondering, a comment, a reflection on what we've talked about today, I think we've got time before we conclude. We're going to have a prayer and then go to breakout rooms, but we've got time for some conversation. Does anybody want to share or ask or wonder?
I do. I just want to thank you for putting this together. Wow. Choked up, but it's overwhelming. And thank you so much for all your work and all you've done for this. This is a lot to think about and to work on. And I thank you so much. And I'm sure we all do. We truly appreciate this, you putting this together, all of you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. I couldn't see who that was, but I see Karen Blatt has her hand up. Or was that Karen?
Yes, it is Karen. This is Reverend Karen Blatt.
Hi, Karen.
Of Lake Huron. I'm just wondering a couple of things, but I would like to just, you may all know about this particular asset, this particular, it is the ALICE report, assets limited, income constrained, working, earning. The ALICE report is put out by the United Way. You could access it if you're not familiar with it by simply going to United Way of whatever state you're in, ALICE report. It was put together by the United Way starting in 2009. And I am speaking from Michigan, where we definitely make use of it because it talks about the fact that, talks about the reality of the working poor, which in another way, and I'm just going to put this out there and you can give me a hard time about it, that's up to you. But the ministry in which I have lived, moved, and had my being for the past 23 years and continue to have is white, rural white America. And I'm hoping, and in a couple, 2 or 3 years ago, I attended at the Wisconsin Council of Churches, the Poor People's Campaign. It's very important, but maybe I'm being short-sighted, etc. And I'll take any criticism that you want to give me. But when do we start to talk about the white poor in America, rural America, and not try to say we have to include everybody? And I'm a former history teacher in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. When I left teaching, I was part of the most integrated multicultural high school in the district. So I come from a history of this, but I'm wanting us to also recognize the reality of white poverty. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Karen Blatt, for that. And that's a reminder to me how poverty is definitely, the question that was asked earlier, what does poverty look like where you are? Poverty looks differently in different places. So thanks for that reminder, Karen Blatt. And Susan Reich, I missed you earlier, seeing you on my slow responding screen, but thank you for your kind comments. Marilyn Kuhn, I see your hand up.
Thank you. I'm one of those people that checked that I am very limited in working with poverty issues, but I'm at a Presbyterian church in Indianapolis, and the United Way just brought in Matthew Desmond to talk about his book, Poverty by America. He was amazing. We bought the book, and now we have several churches, several congregations, I should say, Jewish, Methodist, Presbyterian, maybe a couple more, and we're going to try to do an interfaith study of Poverty by America in the Indianapolis, Marion area. So that's our first start. So I just wanted to mention, one, that resource, and two, I'm so excited to be a part of an interfaith group looking at this issue.
Yeah, excellent, Marilyn. Thank you. I do think sharing ideas with one another is very helpful. So maybe somebody can post the book. I think it's Poverty by America, Matthew Desmond. And nice to hear that that's being done in a ecumenical context in Indianapolis. I missed a question from Placide. It's and that's in chat. Whoops, it just jumped on me. Darn it. I'm sorry. Can somebody see? Let's see if I can find that. Ellen, can you read that question for us?
Sure. Can churches / people with life-changing and youth empowerment and poverty reduction projects get support from PCUSA? If yes, how?
Sounds like a question for the, I don't know, who could take that question? Is that a self-development of people, Alonzo? Is that a hunger project, hunger program?
Good question, Carl. It could be an amalgam of different programs, right? Depending on the work and what folks are doing. I think one of the things that I think is really important is to understand and make this connection with your national church, all of us here, and the work that we do. I think connecting with you, finding out what it is you're doing, finding out the impact of the community these are really important aspects of it. So I think, yeah, I want to say yes, but I also do want to say that we'd like to learn more. And how do we be in conversation with you to find out what it is exactly, what your needs are. So I think that that's important to kind of lift up that, yeah, I mean, we would be more than happy to walk with you. Just let us know what it is you're doing and who it's impacting.
Great. Great. Thanks, Alonzo. If you're not seeing chat, Kathy Bubb has suggested another great book is Broke in America by Goldblum and Craddox. So that's been posted in our chat. And of course, we'll be collecting these suggestions and adding them to lists of resources that are being developed. So thanks for that. That crowdsourcing of resources. And Jenny has posted a link to the Poverty by America book by Matthew Desmond. Okay, I think unless I missed something, Rebecca?
Okay, yeah, we wanted to share a little bit. I put this in chat and I will try again. Just to make sure it didn't leap on people. I am going to share a 1 minute, 20-second video from my hunger program colleague, Andrew Kong Bartlett, who with other colleagues is hosting our next webinar in a month, just to give you a little plug for that. And then we will have a closing prayer, but hope that you stay on for small groups so we can really have conversation in a smaller than 130-person Zoom. So Ellen will walk us through that. But first, just want to share this with you. And again, make sure it has, yes, the optimization.
Want. Poverty is complex, and so addressing it and measuring our progress require tools that account for complexity, while also keeping before us a vision of the world we want. Beloved communities, and a beloved economy. Whole Measures is a tool that accounts for the complex, interconnected nature of poverty. This tool for planning and measuring success is based on the values we collectively hold, and it can help us evaluate if we are on the right track. Our society and the communities we live in need healing, and to heal literally means to make whole. So join us in June to learn about Whole Measures.
I'm sorry that video didn't work very well. We can link to it or send a copy later. But again, the information is in your chat box. There's a registration also for that Zoom happening a month from now. And it's about a tool that can be adapted by churches to think about the questions we use and the goals we have to end systemic poverty. So with that, I will share our prayer and then turn it over to Ellen for the small group. So let me share. Okay, and if you want to stay on mute but join in, I welcome you to do that. This is a reading on hope. Jesus said, "Whoever wants to economize his or her life will lose it. Whoever spends it for me will recover it in eternal life." But we are afraid of spending life, giving it over without reservations. A terrible instinct of conservation carries us towards selfishness and grips us when we want to risk our lives. We have insurance policies all over the place to avoid risks, and above all is cowardice. Lord Jesus, we are afraid to spend our lives, but you have given us life in order to spend it. It cannot be economized in sterile selfishness. To spend one's life is to work for others, even though they do not pay, to do a favor for someone who will not return it. To spend one's life is to throw oneself even toward failure if need be, without false prudence. We are torches which only make sense when we are burning. Only then will we be light. Spending one's life is not done with pompous expense and false drama. Life is given simply, without publicity, like water from a spring, like a mother nurses her child, like the humble sweat of the sower. Teach us, O Lord, to throw ourselves towards the impossible, because behind the impossible is your grace and your presence. We cannot fall into the void. The future is a mystery. Our path penetrates the fog, but we want to keep giving of ourselves because you are waiting for us in the new dawn of your kingdom. And I will stop sharing. You have seen this website before. We will email it out and turn it over to Ellen to share more about small groups for those who can stay until 3:30 and talk with one another.
Okay, so yes,